dust crusted in her eyelashes, tasting like dried blood and old copper. She was supposed to die in that ravine. The Navy had probably already drafted the hollow sterile letter for her family. They just didn't factor in a mangy 70-pound feral shepherd with half an ear and nothing left to lose. The rock felt like a meat grinder against Cassidy's spine. Every time she inhaled, the fractured ribs on her left side ground together with a sound like wet gravel. She was bleeding out in a dry wash somewhere in the unforgiving borderlands of a country she was never officially in. The ambush had been loud, chaotic, and brief. An IED beneath the lead vehicle, the deafening overpressure that liquefied the air, and then the blind, chaotic scramble. Cassidy remembered the feeling of nothingness beneath her boots, the sheer drop into the ravine, the sickening snap of her femur taking the brunt of her tactical gear's weight when she hit the bottom. Her rifle was gone. Her radio was crushed into jagged plastic and wire embedded in her hip. Now there was just the heat. It baked the shale beneath her, radiating upward through her sweat-soaked uniform. The smell was intense, a foul cocktail of diesel from the burning wreck miles above, her own voided bowels, and the heavy metallic stench of arterial blood pooling in the dust. Cassidy didn't feel heroic. She didn't think of the flag, or her teammates, or the trident pinned to her dress uniform back in Coronado. She just felt deeply, profoundly irritated. It was a stupid way to die. She tilted her head, ignoring the spike of nausea. The sun was a blinding white hole in the sky, beginning its slow drag toward the ridgeline. When the sun dipped, the temperature would plummet 30 degrees in an hour. If the blood loss didn't stop her heart, the cold would. A shadow detached itself from the scrub brush 30 yards away. Cassidy's hand twitched toward her drop-leg holster. Her fingers brushed the molded polymer of her sidearm. Her vision swam, graying at the edges, but she forced her eyes to focus. It wasn't an insurgent. It wasn't a patrol. It was a dog. It moved with the stiff, uneven gait of an animal that had spent its entire life being kicked. It was a German shepherd, or at least it had been generations ago, before the harsh desert and brutal street breeding had stripped away the breed's show-ring majesty. Its coat was patchy, matted with burrs and dried mud. Ribs pushed against its flanks like cage wire. One ear stood at attention. The other had been torn away, leaving a jagged, healed stump. It stopped 10 feet away. The dog didn't growl. It didn't wag its tail. It just stared. Its eyes were a pale, washed-out amber, entirely devoid of the eager-to-please warmth people expected from dogs. These were the eyes of a scavenger. "Fuck off," Cassidy croaked. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. The dog sat. It licked its chops, staring at the dark, wet stain expanding across the tan fabric of Cassidy's trousers. It's waiting for me to die, she realized. The thought should have terrified her, but it only fueled her exhausted annoyance. "I'm not dead yet, you ugly bastard," she whispered, her fingers wrapping around the grip of her pistol. She tried to unholster it, just to fire a warning shot, but her wrist was weak. The gun stayed locked in the kydex. The shepherd lowered its head, sniffing the air. It caught the scent of her blood. The animal took 2 steps forward, its nose twitching. It smelled like rancid garbage and wet dust. Cassidy managed to pry a fist-sized rock from the dirt beside her. She threw it. The motion sent a wave of agony so pure and white-hot through her broken leg that she nearly blacked out. The rock landed 2 feet short, kicking up a puff of dust. The dog didn't flinch. It just watched the rock, then looked back at her. Slowly, methodically, it closed the distance. Cassidy braced herself for the teeth. She imagined the jaws clamping down on her exposed throat, the feral instinct to tear into wounded prey. She closed her eyes. Make it fast, she thought. Just hit the carotid. A rough sandpaper tongue rasped across her cheek. Cassidy's eyes snapped open. The shepherd was standing over her. The smell of its breath was awful, decaying meat and bone marrow. But it wasn't biting. It was licking the dried blood from the gash on her forehead. Get away, she hissed, trying to shove its heavy, bony chest. The dog grunted, absorbing her weak push without losing ground. It stepped over her chest, the weight of its paws pressing uncomfortably into her gear, and curled up directly against her uninjured side. Cassidy lay paralyzed. She could feel the rapid, thrumming heartbeat of the animal against her ribs. She could feel the coarse, filthy hair scratching against her neck. She hated it. She hated the vulnerability, the pathetic reality of needing comfort from a feral scavenger. She wanted to die alone, stoic, a silent operator fading into the dirt. But as the sun finally slipped behind the mountains, and the first brutal chill of the desert night swept through the canyon, Cassidy stopped pushing the dog away. By midnight, the temperature was in the low 30s. The wind howled down the dry wash, picking up grit that sandblasted Cassidy's exposed face. She was shivering so violently, her teeth chipped against each other. Every spasm of her muscles pulled at the jagged bone ends in her thigh. Her brain was misfiring, slipping in and out of a fevered delirium. She thought she heard Hayes, her squad leader, calling her name from the ridgeline. She yelled back, but all that came out was a wet, pathetic wheeze. Through the haze of pain and hypothermia, there was only one anchor keeping her tethered to consciousness, the heavy, radiating furnace of the dog. It hadn't moved. The shepherd was curled into a tight ball, its spine pressed flush against Cassidy's flank, its scarred head resting heavily across her neck. It was acting as a living blanket, trapping her dissipating body heat and offering its own. Cassidy hated how much she needed it. "You're full of fleas," she muttered into the dark, her voice trembling uncontrollably. The dog let out a low huff, a puff of warm air hitting her jaw but didn't shift. Her leg was throbbing with a sick, heavy rhythm. Infection was setting in. She knew the signs. The skin around the tear in her pants was hot to the touch, swollen and tight. She fumbled with cold, numb fingers at one of her chest pouches, finally extracting a crushed, morphing syrette. She jammed it into her uninjured thigh, pushing the plunger down with her thumb. The relief wasn't a wave. It was a slow, muddy dulling of the sharpest edges. It made her heavy. It made her careless. "What's your name, Ugly?" she whispered to the dog. She reached up with a heavy hand and buried her fingers in the scruff behind its neck. The fur was coated in a greasy layer of dirt and sebum. It felt disgusting. She kept her hand there anyway. The dog whined, a high, thin sound that broke the howling wind. It shifted, turning its head to lick at the wound on Cassidy's leg. She tried to kick it away, crying out as the pain flared. "Don't fucking touch it!" The dog backed off, ears pinned flat, lowering its head. In the dim moonlight, Cassidy could see the yellow glint of its eyes. It looked scolded. "Just stay," she gasped, her chest heaving, fighting back a wave of nausea. "Just stay here." It crept back, inching forward on its belly until it was pressed against her side again. Cassidy let her head fall back against the rock. The cynicism she wore like armor was cracking. She had spent 10 years proving she was harder, faster, and more lethal than the men around her. She had built an identity out of being untouchable. Now she was weeping silently into the dirt, her tears freezing on her cheeks, clutching a stray animal to keep her blood flowing. Hours bled into one another. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, it began to rain. Not a downpour, but a freezing, miserable drizzle that slicked the rocks and soaked through her uniform. The dog stood up. Cassidy felt the immediate loss of heat. The cold rushed in to fill the void, biting into her bones. "No," she whimpered, the sound entirely devoid of military discipline. "No, come back." The shepherd shook itself, water flying from its matted coat, and trotted away into the darkness. Cassidy was alone. The silence of the ravine pressed down on her. The morphine was wearing off, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying clarity. She was going to freeze to death. The dog had realized she was a lost cause and abandoned her. It was the smart thing to do. She would have done the same. She closed her eyes, preparing to let go. The shivering was stopping. That was a bad sign. It meant her core temperature was dropping below the body's ability to fight. A warm, seductive lethargy began to spread outward from her chest. Crunch, crunch, the sound of paws on shale. Cassidy forced her eyes open. The dog was back. But it wasn't empty-handed. It dropped something heavy and wet onto Cassidy's chest. It smelled like wet canvas and dried blood. Cassidy weakly lifted her head. It was her own tactical assault pack, the one she had lost during the fall. It had rolled further down the wash. The dog had hunted it down, dragging it by the nylon straps. She stared at the animal. The shepherd was panting, its breath pluming in the freezing air, blood dripping from its gums where the tough nylon had cut its mouth. Cassidy fumbled with the pack zippers. Her fingers were stiff, useless claws, but she managed to rip open the main compartment. Inside was a silver foil-lined thermal emergency blanket. She pulled it out with shaking hands, shaking it open with a crinkling snap that echoed in the wash. She draped it over herself. The dog didn't wait for an invitation. It crawled right under the crinkling foil, wedging itself tightly against her ribs once more. Beneath the reflective layer, their combined body heat began to slowly, agonizingly bake the freezing air. Cassidy wrapped her arm around the dog's rib cage. She could feel the scars on its hide, the topography of a violent life. "Okay," she breathed, her voice cracking. "Okay, buddy. We hold the line right here." Dawn broke not with light, but with the distant mechanical thrum of a drone. Cassidy's eyes snapped open. The sound was faint, a high-pitched whine echoing off the canyon walls. It could be American overhead surveillance, or it could be a commercial quadcopter rigged with explosives by the local militia. She tried to sit up and immediately threw up. A stream of yellow bile splashed onto the rocks. Her body was done. Her thigh was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin taut and angry red, streaked with purple. The infection had moved into her bloodstream. She was running a massive fever. The cold desert morning felt like a furnace. The dog was standing near her feet, staring up at the sky, its remaining ear twitching like a radar dish. "They're coming," Cassidy rasped, wiping her mouth with the back of a filthy glove. She checked her pistol. 1 magazine, 15 rounds. She racked the slide, chambering a round. It felt incredibly heavy. A shadow passed over the wash. Then came the voices. They were shouting in a language Cassidy understood well enough to know they weren't search and rescue. They were sweeping the area, looking for the bodies from the convoy ambush, looking for the spoils. They were maybe 500 yards away, moving down the dry riverbed. Cassidy looked at the dog. "Go," she whispered. "Get out of here. Scat." The shepherd looked at her, then looked toward the sound of the voices. The fur along its spine stood up in a rigid, ugly ridge. A deep guttural rumble started in its chest, vibrating in the still air. "Don't be stupid," Cassidy coughed, the effort tearing at her ribs. "They'll shoot you. Go!" She threw a small handful of gravel at it. The dog ignored the rocks. It trotted back to her side, grabbed the heavy webbing of her plate carrier in its jaws, and pulled. Cassidy screamed. The sudden movement shifted her broken femur, sending a spike of blinding, nauseating agony straight into her brain. "Stop! Fucking stop!" She hit the dog with the butt of her pistol. The dog let go, dodging the blow. It paced in a tight circle, whining, before stepping back in. It didn't grab her vest this time. It bit down on the heavy nylon drag handle situated at the nape of her neck on the plate carrier. The handle designed for a fellow soldier to drag a wounded comrade out of the line of fire. The dog clamped its jaws shut, its yellow teeth sinking into the thick fabric, braced its front legs, and pulled backward. Cassidy was dragged 2 feet across the sharp shale. She bit clean through her lower lip to keep from screaming again. Copper flooded her mouth. The pain was an ocean, drowning her, pulling her under. The dog dug its claws into the dirt. It wasn't built for this. It was starved, battered, and slipping on the loose rocks. But it was entirely consumed by a manic, single-minded drive. It pulled her another foot, then another. "Leave me," Cassidy sobbed, her pride completely shattered. She was a burden, dead weight. "Just let me die, you stupid animal." The dog didn't listen. It grunted, the sound wet and choked as the strap dug into its mouth. It dragged her toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a deep crevice obscured by a tangle of dead, thorny brush. Cassidy felt the rocks tearing through her pants, shredding the skin of her uninjured leg. She could hear the voices getting louder. The patrol was close. She could hear the crunch of their boots, the rattle of their AKs. "Pull," she thought, suddenly desperate, her hand reaching back blindly to grip the dog's scruff, trying to push herself backward with her good leg to ease its burden. "Pull, you stubborn bastard!" The dog heaved. Blood smeared the rocks beneath its paws where the pads were tearing open from the friction. It dragged her through the dead brush, the thorns raking across Cassidy's face and catching in the dog's already ragged coat. With one final violent tug, the dog pulled her into the dark, narrow fissure, just as the vanguard of the patrol rounded the bend in the dry wash. The dog collapsed beside her, panting violently. Its chest heaved, spraying fine mists of blood from its torn gums. Cassidy lay in the shadows, her hand clamped tight over the dog's muzzle to keep it quiet. The animal didn't fight her. It lay perfectly still, its amber eyes locked on hers, its hot breath steaming against her palm. Footsteps crunched past the brush. 2 men. They were speaking loudly, complaining about the heat. They stopped right outside the crevice. One of them kicked the dirt. Cassidy held her breath until her lungs burned, her finger trembling on the trigger of her sidearm. If they looked down, she would shoot. She would kill the first one, and the second one would kill her. A long, agonizing minute passed. The men moved on, their voices fading down the wash. Cassidy slowly released the dog's muzzle. Her hand was trembling. The dog licked her palm, a slow, exhausted drag of its rough tongue. Cassidy dropped her head back against the stone wall of the crevice. She looked at the mangy, bleeding animal curled against her side. She looked at the bloody paw prints it had left on the rocks, proof of the impossible weight it had just pulled. "You're a good boy," she whispered, her voice cracking, tears tracking through the dirt on her face. "You're a really good boy." The dog let out a heavy sigh, rested its chin on her armored chest, and closed its eyes. The crevice became a tomb of stagnant air and suffocating heat. As the morning dragged into noon, the sun climbed high enough to strike the western wall of the ravine, turning the narrow stone fissure into a literal oven. Cassidy's fever broke the thermometer of her own sanity. She was sweating so profusely that her uniform clung to her skin like a second clammy hide, pooling in the ballistic folds of her vest. The smell in the enclosed space was atrocious. It was the sickly sweet scent of rotting fruit mixed with the sharp metallic tang of oxidized blood, rising directly from the swollen purple flesh of her ruined thigh. The infection was no longer knocking. It had kicked the door in. Beside her, the shepherd panted with a rapid mechanical rhythm. Its tongue lolled out, dry and coated in pale dust, the edges curling upward. It didn't have the energy to lift its head any more. It just lay there, pressed into her uninjured side, its ribcage expanding and contracting in short, desperate hitches. Every so often, its torn ear would flick, registering the distant ghostly echoes of the desert wind bouncing off the shale. Cassidy slipped in and out of the waking world. Delirium took the form of auditory hallucinations. She heard the distinct rhythmic splash of a garden sprinkler, a sound from a childhood backyard in suburban Illinois, completely out of place in this barren wasteland. She heard the clinking of ice in a glass. She heard her squad leader, Hayes, arguing over a radio frequency, his voice distorted by static. "Rally at Point Bravo," the phantom voice hissed in her ear. "Cassidy, where are you, kid?" "I'm here," she mumbled. Her tongue felt like a piece of dry felt shoved into her mouth. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, the dried scabs tearing open every time she tried to form a word. "I'm right here." The dog shifted, letting out a low, miserable whine. It pushed its dry nose against her cheek. The rough texture grounded her, pulling her violently out of the hallucination. The sprinkler vanished. The ice vanished. There was only the baking stone, the blinding sliver of sunlight cutting through the dead brush, and the agonizing throb of her leg. "I know," she whispered to the animal, her breath catching in her chest. "I'm thirsty too." She reached down, her fingers trembling wildly, and traced the deep, jagged scars along the dog's flank. The animal didn't flinch. It just leaned into the weak pressure of her hand. They were tethered together now, two dying things clinging to the absolute bottom rung of survival. Cassidy realized, with a strange, detached clarity, that she no longer viewed the dog as an animal. It was a witness. It was the only living thing on earth that knew exactly how she was spending her final hours. There was an intense, raw intimacy in that shared suffering. By mid-afternoon, her vision began to tunnel. The edges of the world faded into a fuzzy, static gray. The pain in her leg had transitioned from a sharp, screaming agony into a heavy, numb weight that seemed to drag her entire body downward. Her organs were shutting down. The sepsis was taking the wheel. She closed her eyes, letting the gray static wash over her. She stopped fighting the heavy narcotic pull of the dark. Then the stone vibrated. It started as a subtle tremor, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the shale beneath her shoulder blades. Cassidy didn't open her eyes. She thought it was an earthquake, or another hallucination brought on by her failing brain. But the tremor grew. It climbed in pitch and intensity until the air inside the crevice began to beat against her eardrums. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It wasn't a drone. It wasn't a pickup truck. It was the heavy concussive rotor wash of twin MH-60M Black Hawks. The sound was deafening, a physical force that rattled the loose gravel around her boots. Cassidy's eyes flew open. The sudden surge of adrenaline was so violent it made her chest heave. She tried to sit up, but her body refused the command. She could only turn her head. Outside the crevice, the canyon erupted into a chaotic storm of flying dirt and airborne debris. The dead thorny brush concealing their hiding spot was whipped into a frenzy, branches snapping and blowing away. The shadow of a massive fuselage swept over the ravine. The dog scrambled to its feet. It was terrified. The noise was apocalyptic to an animal used to the quiet desolation of the desert. It backed into the deepest, narrowest point of the fissure, its tail tucked firmly between its legs, barking frantically. The sound was entirely lost over the roar of the rotors. "Hey," Cassidy choked out, reaching a shaking hand toward it. "Hey, it's okay. It's ours." The dog couldn't hear her. It paced in a tight, panicked circle, kicking up dust. Through the sliver of the opening, Cassidy saw a pair of boots hit the dirt. They were tan combat boots, laced tight over green flight suits. A rifle barrel swung into view, equipped with a suppressor and an advanced optic. Someone shouted, the voice amplified by the comms gear beneath a helmet. "Spread out! Check the wash! ISR had a heat signature here before the cloud cover." It was English. It was American. Cassidy tried to yell. She filled her lungs, ignoring the agonizing grind of her broken ribs, and pushed the air out. What emerged was a pathetic, broken wheeze. The rotor wash drowned it out completely. She was 10 feet away from rescue, but she might as well have been on the moon. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak loudly enough to be heard. The boots outside turned away. The operator was moving past the crevice, heading further down the wash. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through Cassidy's fever. They were going to leave her. They were going to walk right past her tomb. She fumbled blindly for her sidearm, intending to fire a round into the dirt just to make noise, but her numb fingers couldn't unclip the retention hood of the holster. The dog stopped pacing. It looked at Cassidy, its amber eyes wide and bright in the dim light. It looked at her desperate, failing struggle with the holster. Then, it looked at the opening of the crevice. The shepherd lunged forward. It didn't cower. It didn't run away from the deafening noise. It shoved its way through the tangled, thorny brush at the entrance, exposing itself completely to the swirling dust and the heavily armed men outside. Cassidy watched in horror. "No," she gasped. "No, they'll shoot." The dog planted its torn, bleeding paws on the edge of the shale and let out a sound that wasn't a bark. It was a roar. It was a deep, guttural, aggressive challenge that cut through the mechanical whine of the idling helicopters. "Contact left," a voice screamed outside. Cassidy saw the laser module of a rifle beam slice through the dust, the green dot painting directly onto the shepherd's sunken ribcage. Hold fire! It's a dog!" another voice barked. "What the hell is it doing?" The dog didn't retreat. It snapped its jaws, lunging a few inches forward, then immediately spun around and darted back into the crevice. It stopped beside Cassidy, grabbed the shoulder strap of her plate carrier in its teeth, and yanked. It was trying to drag her out into the light. A shadow fell over the opening. A helmeted head peered into the gloom. The operator's night vision goggles were flipped up, his face covered by a protective buff. His eyes widened behind his ballistic glasses. "Holy s**," the man breathed. He reached over his shoulder, keying the radio mic on his chest. "I have her. Found her. Get the medic up here now. She's critical." The next 10 minutes were a blur of organized violence. Hands reached into the dark. A pararescue jumper, a massive man with medical shears, descended into the crevice. The dog immediately placed itself between the medic and Cassidy, baring its teeth, a low growl rattling in its throat. "Easy, buddy," the medic said, drawing his sidearm and pointing it at the dirt. "I need to get to her. Call it off, Cassidy." Don't shoot," Cassidy croaked. Her vision was swimming again. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a crushing wave of exhaustion. She forced her hand up, burying her fingers in the dog's filthy scruff. "Stand down," she whispered. "Stand down." The dog felt her touch. It looked back at her, the wildness slowly draining from its amber eyes. It released the low growl, stepping back an inch, but it refused to leave her side. The medic moved in. He cut away her trousers, applied a tourniquet high on her thigh to stem the spread of the poisoned blood, and jammed an IV into her arm. The pain of being moved onto the rigid sked litter was so absolute that Cassidy finally lost her grip on consciousness. As she was dragged out of the crevice and into the blinding desert sun, the last thing she felt was the rough sandpaper texture of a tongue licking the dried blood from her knuckles. The hospital smelled like bleach, rubbing alcohol and sterile linens. It was an aggressive, artificial cleanliness that assaulted Cassidy's senses the moment she dragged herself out of the medically induced coma. She was in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The transition from the baking, filthy ravine to the pristine white walls of the intensive care unit was jarring. Her left leg was elevated, wrapped in thick bandages. A steel external fixator bolted directly into her femur. Tubes ran into her arms, pumping her full of broad-spectrum antibiotics and heavy painkillers. A nurse was adjusting the drip when Cassidy finally managed to open her eyes fully. The light burned. "Welcome back, Chief," the nurse said softly, noticing the movement. "You've been out for 4 days. You gave us a real scare." Cassidy didn't care about the days. She didn't care about the steel pins holding her leg together. Her mouth was dry, her throat raspy from the intubation tube they had just removed. She swallowed hard, forcing the muscles to work. "The dog," she rasped. The nurse paused, her professional smile faltering slightly. "Excuse me? Where is the dog?" Cassidy demanded, her voice gaining a fraction of its normal command. I don't know anything about a dog, Chief. Let me get the attending." An hour later, her squad leader, Hayes, walked into the room. He looked exhausted, deep circles bruising the skin under his eyes, but his shoulders dropped in relief when he saw her awake. He pulled a chair up to the side of the bed. "You're a tough son of a bitch, Cassidy," he said, resting a hand on her uninjured knee. "We thought we'd lost you when that wash collapsed." "Hayes, the shepherd, the dog that was with me." Hayes grimaced, rubbing the back of his neck. It was the look he gave when an operation had gone sideways. "He's here. They flew him back on the transport. The PJs refused to leave him behind after he practically chewed through a Kevlar strap trying to follow your litter onto the bird." "Where is he?" "Base quarantine," Hayes said quietly. "Cass, you need to prepare yourself. The brass is involved. He's a feral animal from a hot zone. He's unregistered, unvaccinated, and aggressive. He bit a handler 2 days ago when they tried to draw blood. Base Command signed an order this morning. They're putting him down at 1800 hours. Cassidy stared at the ceiling. The heavy narcotic warmth of the painkillers suddenly felt like poison in her veins. She remembered the freezing rain. She remembered the weight of the animal curled against her spine, the way it had dragged her bleeding body across the shale, tearing its own paws to shreds just to keep her hidden. "No, they're not," she said. "Cass, it's not a pet. It's standard protocol for—" "I don't give a fuck-a-wong about protocol," Cassidy yelled. The sudden outburst tore at her fractured ribs, sending a spike of agony through her chest, but she ignored it. She grabbed the plastic tubing of her IV and ripped it clean out of her forearm. Blood immediately bloomed across the white sheets. "Whoa, hey!" Hayes jumped up, grabbing her hand to apply pressure. "Are you insane? Stop! Get me a wheelchair," Cassidy snarled, her eyes burning with a fierce, manic clarity. "Get me a chair right now, Hayes, or I will crawl out of this bed on my hands and bleed all over this fucking floor." Hayes looked at her. He had served with her for 6 years. He knew the look in her eyes. It was the same look she had right before kicking in a compound door. He didn't argue. He hit the call button, yelled for some gauze, and went to find a chair. The journey to the quarantine facility was a haze of agonizing jolts. Every seam in the linoleum floor sent a shock wave into the steel pins in her leg. She was wearing nothing but a hospital gown and a borrowed fleece jacket, her bare foot resting heavily on the metal footplate. Hayes pushed her, his face locked in a grim scowl as they bypassed 2 layers of bewildered security guards. The quarantine kennels were loud. The smell of strong disinfectant and wet concrete hung heavy in the air. As Hayes pushed her down the central aisle, the barking of military working dogs echoed off the cinder block walls. At the very end of the row, in an isolated cage wrapped in chain link and plexiglass, the barking stopped. Cassidy gripped the wheels of her chair, bringing it to a halt. The shepherd was lying in the corner of the concrete run. They had shaved patches of its fur to treat its wounds, exposing the angry bruised skin beneath. It looked even thinner under the harsh fluorescent lights, a pathetic collection of sharp angles and scar tissue. A veterinary technician was standing by the cage door with a clipboard. He looked up, startled by the arrival of a wounded operator in a wheelchair. "Ma'am, you can't be in here. This animal is scheduled for—" "Open the cage," Cassidy said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute, unforgiving authority of a Tier 1 operator. "I can't do that. It's aggressive. It's a biohazard." Cassidy looked at the technician. "I spent 2 days bleeding on that animal. Whatever he has, I have. Open the fucking door, or I will have my squad leader physically remove you from the room." Hayes crossed his arms, staring the technician down. The tech swallowed hard, fumbled with his keys, and unlocked the heavy padlock. He stepped back quickly. Cassidy leaned forward, gritting her teeth against the pain, and pushed the heavy metal door open. The shepherd didn't move at first. It raised its head, its remaining ear twitching. It looked at the wheelchair. It looked at the bandages. Then it caught her scent beneath the hospital bleach. The dog stood up. Its legs were shaking. It didn't bark. It didn't growl. It limped forward, its claws clicking softly against the concrete, until it reached the edge of the wheelchair. Cassidy reached out. Her hand was trembling. The dog lowered its head and pressed its heavy, scarred snout firmly into her open palm. It let out a long, shuddering sigh, its breath warm against her skin. Cassidy leaned forward, burying her face in the coarse, uneven fur of its neck. She didn't care about the dirt. She didn't care about the regulations. The tears she had refused to shed in the ravine finally broke loose, soaking into the dog's coat. The feral scavenger, the beast the world had discarded, leaned its full weight against her shattered leg, anchoring her exactly as it had in the dark. "You're coming home with me," she whispered fiercely into the quiet kennel. "I've got you. We hold the line right here." Did this incredible story of survival and unlikely loyalty leave you breathless? The bond between a soldier and a dog goes deeper than training, It's forged in blood and grit. If Cassidy and this stray German Shepherd moved you, drop a like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more gripping raw tales from the front lines. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Let us know in the comments, what would you name him?